The word was spoken at 2:14, a soft, trembling sound in a cold interrogation room that usually echoed with the sounds of threats and broken promises. But this word was different. It didn't come from a soldier or a rival. It came from Emily Carter, a terrified witness with no connection to the underworld. "Iyama," she whispered. The Mafia boss, Kang Min-yi, stopped mid-sentence. He froze, at first thinking he had misheard, that his mind was playing tricks on him after decades of silence. Then she said it again, shorter, shakier, her eyes wide with a desperation she didn't understand. "Iyama, please." Min-yi's breath stilled. He had seen violence. He had inflicted pain. But he had never heard that word, not since the winter of 1985 when he was left in a Seoul alleyway and told to forget his name if he wanted to live. His men, led by the ruthless enforcer Seo Jin-teek, watched in confusion as the boss's hand began to tremble. They expected him to finish the job. They expected him to protect the organization. Instead, Min-yi did something they had never seen. He closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path through his hardened exterior. "Boss, what is she saying?" Jin-teek asked, his hand moving toward his holster. Min-yi didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that woman's accidental slip of the tongue, a part of him he thought had died 30 years ago suddenly screamed back to life. Tonight, he wasn't just a boss protecting a territory. He was a son hearing his mother's voice in the middle of a nightmare, and the choice he made in that room changed everything. "Stay with me until the end, because the secret Emily Carter was unknowingly carrying will make your heart stop and reveal a truth that the underworld tried to bury forever." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment. What is one memory from your childhood you could never forget? Now let's get started. The rain in the city didn't fall so much as it dissolved, turning the neon-lit streets into a blurred watercolor of gray and bruised purple. Emily Carter hurried along the sidewalk, her light-colored coat pulled tight against a wind that seemed determined to peel the warmth from her bones. She was a woman of routine, a creature of habit who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of her walk from the library to her small apartment. But tonight, the rhythm was broken. A screech of tires, a flash of movement in the mouth of a dark alley, and the sudden sharp scent of ozone and copper changed the trajectory of her life forever. She had seen it, the flash of a silenced barrel, the slump of a man who was important enough to die in a tailored suit, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the man who had pulled the trigger. She had frozen, a deer in the glowing amber of a predator's gaze, and before she could scream, the world went black. When Emily finally opened her eyes, she wasn't on the rain-slicked pavement anymore. She was in a space that felt carved out of the very concept of shadows, a high-ceilinged hideout that smelled of expensive cigar smoke, gun oil, and an underlying current of absolute, terrifying authority. The room was vast, an industrial shell repurposed into a palace of cold efficiency. Emily sat on a hard wooden chair, her wrists bound loosely but firmly with zip ties that bit into her skin whenever she flinched. The light above her was single and harsh, creating a cone of interrogation that made the rest of the room seem like an endless void. She could hear the muffled sound of footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and disciplined. These were not the sounds of common criminals. These were the sounds of an army. Out of the darkness, figures began to coalesce. Men in dark suits, their faces partially blurred by the play of light and shadow, stood like sentinels at the edges of her vision. They didn't speak to her. They didn't even look at her. They simply waited, their rigid stances amplifying a tension that made Emily's heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was the wrong witness, a civilian who had accidentally stumbled into a theater of war, and she knew with a sickening clarity that in this world, witnesses were not protected. They were erased. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors at the far end of the room groaned open. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the air growing heavy with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The enforcers in the shadows straightened their backs, their blurred faces turning toward the entrance with a mixture of reverence and fear. Walking toward the light was a man who seemed to carry the darkness with him. This was Kang Min-yi, the boss, the man the streets called the Ice King. He moved with a slow, intentional grace, his dark suit perfectly tailored to a frame that suggested years of controlled violence. His hair was slicked back, revealing a face etched with deep lines of power and loss. Behind him, close enough to be a shadow but far enough to show respect, was Seo Jin-teek. Jin-teek was the physical manifestation of the organization's malice, younger, broader, with eyes that scanned the room for threats even when there were none. As Min-yi entered the circle of light, Emily felt a primal urge to shrink into the wood of her chair. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, as if the decision of whether she lived or died was a mundane clerical error he had been forced to correct. Min-yi stopped a few feet away from her, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't speak. He simply studied her, his gaze clinical and detached. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, her pupils large with a shock that hadn't yet faded into the dull ache of reality. She looked at him, the slick-back hair, the black shirt, the aura of a man who had long ago decided that the world was his to command. She tried to find words to plead for her life, to tell him she hadn't seen anything, but her throat was a desert of fear. Beside him, Jin-teek leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like stones grinding together. She was at the pier, boss. She saw the whole thing. The cleanup crew found her before she could call it in. Jin-teek's hand hovered near his holster, a silent suggestion that the most efficient way to handle a witness was to ensure they stayed silent forever. Min-yi remained unmoved, his eyes locked on Emily's trembling form. He was the man who had spent 30 years building a throne on the corpses of his heritage, and to him, Emily Carter was nothing more than a stray variable in a complex equation. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on Emily's chest. Every second that passed without a command felt like a stay of execution, yet the inevitability of the end hung in the air like a guillotine blade. She looked past Min-yi at the men in the background, the silent threat of an empire built on the erasure of identity. They were muscle, not meaning, waiting for the word that would send her back into the rain-dissolved streets as a ghost. Emily felt the hand gripped tightly near her chest, her light coat now stained with the grime of the hideout. She was a woman who had never known violence, a woman whose most daring act was staying late at the library, and now she was the accidental catalyst for a moment that outranked violence. She looked at Min-yi, desperate for a spark of humanity in his weathered face, but all she saw was the cold, unyielding mask of the Mafia boss. He was the man who finally understands that power is a lonely business, and she was the mistake that had interrupted his reign. As Jin-teek continued to detail the logistics of disposal, Min-yi finally moved. He took a single step closer, the tip of his polished shoe entering Emily's personal space. He leaned down, his face only inches from hers, and for a moment the mask of the Ice King flickered. Up close, his eyes weren't just cold, they were tired, carrying an emotional weight that seemed at odds with his dark black shirt and controlled authority. He reached out a hand not to strike her but to tilt her chin up so she was forced to meet his gaze. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. His voice was a low, melodic hum, the sound of a predator that didn't need to roar. Emily shook her head, her mouth slightly open, a sob catching in her throat. She didn't know his name, but she knew his nature. She knew he was the end of her story. She was the trigger, not the weapon. And as the men in the background shifted their feet in anticipation, Emily felt the invisible line between life and death begin to blur. The hideout was a tomb of buried memories, a place where Kang Min-yi had successfully hidden the boy he used to be. Every person in this room, from the lowest gunman to the ruthless Jin-teek, believed they knew the man standing before them. They saw the boss, the Doombringer, the man who had traded his Korean soul for a Western crown. They didn't see the single tear that was waiting to fall, nor did they hear the echoes of a language he had spent decades trying to forget. Emily, clutching her clothing in a gesture of pure, instinctual terror, was the only one who saw the heavy lines on his face for what they truly were, scars of denial. The split composition of the room, with Emily's chaos on one side and Minyi's finality on the other, was a visual representation of cause and consequence. She had seen the hit, and now she had to see the man. The tension was no longer just about survival. It was psychological, a silent war between the woman who had made a mistake and the man who was about to realize that his entire life was won. "Why were you there?" Minyi asked, his grip on her chin firm but surprisingly devoid of cruelty. It was the question that mattered, the one that would determine if she was a plant, a spy, or simply a tragedy. Emily tried to speak, but the words were caught in the gears of her panic. She saw Jinteek's impatience, the way he watched for any sign of the boss's hesitation. She knew that if Minyi showed a single crack of mercy, the men in the shadows would sense it like sharks sensing blood in the water. This moment had rules, and none of them were in Emily's favor. She was the civilian in the hoodie, the light-colored coat a beacon of innocence in a room of matte black suits and slick-back hair. She was the shock to his system, the realization that no matter how deep he buried his past, the world would always find a way to dig it up. Minyi stared at her, waiting for an answer that would never come in English, while the silent threat of the gunmen loomed larger with every passing heartbeat. The chapter of the wrong witness was nearing its climax. Minyi straightened up, turning his back on her for a moment to consult with Jinteek. The movement was calm, slow, and intentional, the posture of a man who had already decided the outcome. Emily watched them, her pupils large, her heart a drumbeat of please, please, please. She saw the diagonal divide between her world and theirs, the split composition of a life about to be torn apart. She didn't mean to be brave, and she certainly didn't mean to be dangerous, but by simply existing in that alleyway, she had become the most dangerous thing in Kang Minyi's life. She was the truth he couldn't kill, and as he turned back to face her, his face calm but heavy, Emily felt the air in the room vanish. The interrogation was over, the decision was made, and the Ice King was about to find out that a single word can weigh more than an entire empire. The men in the background stood rigid, watching and waiting, witnesses to a moment that was about to outrank violence and change the underworld forever. As the heavy doors of the hideout remained shut, keeping the rain and the city at bay, Emily Carter realized that she wasn't just a witness to a murder. She was a witness to a man's soul. And Kang Minyi, the Mafia boss who had finally reached the end of denial, looked at the terrified woman in the light-colored coat and felt the first tremor of an earthquake 30 years in the making. The wrong witness had brought the right truth into a room of lies, and as Minyi prepared to give the order that would define his legacy, the silent threat of his heritage began to scream from the shadows. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and the one word that would break the world was only a heartbeat away from being spoken. Emily gripped her coat, her eyes wide, and in that freezing hideout, the Ice King finally realized that the silence he had cultivated for 3 decades was about to be shattered by a mistake that was never really a mistake at all. The legend of the Ice King was not built on the volume of his voice, but on the absolute terrifying stillness that followed it. In the criminal landscape of the city, where power was usually measured in gunfire and bravado, Kang Minyi stood apart as a monument to silence. He was a second-generation boss who had perfected the art of being invisible while sitting on a throne of shadows. To his enemies, he was a ghost. To his men, he was a god who demanded total erasure of the self. Behind his back, they whispered that he had no blood in his veins, only chilled mercury. He had spent 30 years cultivating a reputation that was more American than the Americans. A man who had stripped every syllable of his native tongue and every memory of the soul alleys from his psyche to ensure that no one could ever find a handle to pull him down. Standing at his right hand was Seo Jinteek, the organization's primary enforcer and its most dangerous variable. If Minyi was the cold, unyielding ice, Jinteek was the jagged edge of a glacier, grinding everything in his path to dust. Jinteek was younger, broader, and fueled by a different kind of hunger, the kind that comes from believing that violence is the only language worth speaking. He watched his boss with a loyalty that was beginning to rot at the edges, replaced by a growing suspicion that the Ice King's stillness was no longer a sign of strength, but a symptom of a man who had grown tired of the weight of his own crown. Jinteek didn't care for legacy or heritage. He cared for the raw, pulsing heat of control, and he watched for any sign of a crack in the boss's frozen exterior with the patience of a scavenger. The power dynamic between the two men was a delicate, vibrating string. Minyi led through the fear of the unknown, while Jinteek led through the fear of the immediate. In the dimly lit corridors of their headquarters, the enforcers and soldiers took their cues from Jinteek's restlessness, their eyes shifting away from the boss's office with a new, subtle insolence. They saw a man in his 50s who still wore his hair slicked back with the precision of a bygone era, a man who spoke in riddles of efficiency, while Jinteek spoke in the reality of domination. The Ice King's court was becoming a hall of mirrors, where every reflection of loyalty was distorted by the simmering ambition of the man who stood just one step behind the throne. Minyi was not blind to the rot. He felt the shift in the air, the way the silent threat of his men felt more like a cage than a shield. He knew that Jinteek was a creature he had created, a weapon that was starting to realize it was sharper than the hand that held it. But Minyi's focus was elsewhere, buried under the layers of the Western identity he had donned like armor. He had convinced himself that he was a man with no past, no family, and no language other than the one used to negotiate the terms of his empire. He had traded his soul for a matte black suit and a dark shirt, believing that if he never looked back, the ghosts of 1985 would eventually stop following him. He was the master of his own amnesia, the architect of a life built on a foundation of silence. But as he stood in the hideout, looking at the wrong witness trembling in the light, the Ice King felt a phantom coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the chill of a memory trying to break through the frost. He watched Emily Carter, her eyes wide and pupils large with a terror that felt uncomfortably familiar. She was a civilian, a nobody, a person whose existence should have been a footnote in his evening. Yet the way she gripped her light-colored coat reminded him of someone else, someone he hadn't thought of in 30 years. Behind him, he could feel Jinteek's gaze, a hot, heavy pressure on the back of his neck. Jinteek was waiting for the command to end it, for the Ice King to live up to his name. The tension in the room was a living thing, a split composition of cause and consequence. Minyi knew that every second he hesitated was a second that Jinteek used to measure the depth of his boss's resolve. In the underworld, hesitation was a death sentence, and the Ice King was currently presiding over his own trial. He looked at the diagonal divide between his world of controlled finality and the woman's world of chaotic fear. He was a man who finally understood that power has a price, and that the currency of the underworld is always the blood of the innocent. But as he prepared to speak, to give the order that would satisfy the wolves in the shadows, he felt his throat tighten in a way it hadn't since he was a child. Co Jinteek stepped forward, his boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete, a sound that cut through the silence like a countdown. "The hit was clean, boss," he said, his voice a low, challenging growl. "But we have a loose end, and loose ends have a habit of turning into nooses." The enforcer's hand hovered over the weapon at his side, his rigid stance a silent ultimatum. He was no longer just a witness to the interrogation. He was a participant in the boss's potential downfall. The men in the background, their faces partially blurred and intentionally out of focus, shifted their weight, their collective breath a heavy fog in the room. They were waiting for the Ice King to bleed. Minyi didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Emily, who looked like she was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. He saw the shock, the fear, and the accidental bravery in her expression. She was the trigger, not the weapon, and he realized with a start that he was the target. Not his life, but his identity, the carefully constructed lie that he was a man who belonged to the city and not to a country across the sea. He felt the single tear begin to form, a physical manifestation of a truth he had denied for 3 decades. He was not the Ice King. He was a boy who was still waiting in an alley for a mother who never came back. Jintique, Minyi said, his voice a low, clinical hum that masked the storm raging inside him. The woman stays. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a moment that outranked violence, a declaration of war against the very foundation of the organization. Jintique's eyes narrowed, his pupils constricting with a sudden, lethal clarity. He didn't understand the why, but he understood the consequence. The boss was compromised. The boss had gone soft. The seeds of mutiny, planted long ago in the fertile soil of ambition, suddenly began to sprout. The Ice King had made his move, and the enforcer was already calculating the counterattack. The room was no longer just a hideout. It was the site of an irreversible transformation. As the men in the background remained frozen, watching the silent duel between the two leaders, Emily Carter looked between them, her mouth slightly open. She didn't know the politics of the underworld, but she knew she had just become the most valuable pawn in a game of death. She saw the heavy lines on Minyi's face settle into a mask of finality, and she saw the cold, unblinking eyes of Jintique turn toward her with a new, predatory intent. The Ice King's court was falling apart, and the only thing holding it together was the singular, unspoken truth that was about to be revealed. The stage was set for the word that broke the world. Minyi had chosen his side, and Jintique had chosen his target. The atmosphere was somber and cinematic, a redemptive narrative hidden within the trappings of a crime thriller. The Ice King had finally reached the end of his denial, and as he closed his eyes for a brief, heavy second, he felt the weight of 30 years of silence finally begin to crack. The trigger had been pulled, the catalyst was in place, and as the men in the shadows prepared for the violence to come, the Ice King realized that to save the woman, he would have to kill the king. The air in the interrogation room didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt pressurized, like the cabin of an airplane moments before a structural failure. Kang Minyi stood in the center of that pressure, his eyes locked on Emily Carter. To his men, he was still the Ice King, a man of absolute Western clinicality. But internally, the walls were weeping. Every time Emily flinched, he saw a ghost. Every time her breath hitched, he heard the wind howling through the corrugated metal of a Seoul slums district 30 years ago. He was a man who had traded his mother tongue for a suit of armor, and for the first time, the armor was chafing against his skin. Seo Jintique took a step closer into the cone of light, the leather of his holster creaking, a deliberate, provocative sound. "Boss," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you said she stays. Fine, but if she stays, she talks. We need to know who she's working for. People don't just stumble onto a high-level liquidation at the pier. Not in this city, not tonight." Jintique reached out and grabbed Emily's shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric of her light coat. He forced her to look up, his face a mask of predatory hunger. "Talk, girl, who sent you? What did you see?" Emily's reaction was visceral. The physical contact snapped the last thread of her composure. Her eyes went wide, the pupils swallowing the irises in a flash of pure, primal shock. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a plant. She was a woman who had spent her childhood in a foster system that had shuffled her through a dozen homes, some of which spoke languages she barely remembered. In this moment of extreme duress, her brain bypassed her English-speaking life entirely, reaching back into the deep, reptilian part of her memory where the only words for mercy and mother resided. She didn't scream for help. She didn't beg for her life in English. Instead, as Jintique's grip tightened, a sound escaped her, a soft, trembling whisper that cut through the warehouse like a razor through silk. "Iyama Jebel." The world stopped. The rhythmic clicking of the cooling industrial lights seemed to freeze in midair. Seo Jintique frowned, his head tilting like a confused dog. He didn't recognize the syllables. To him, it was just the gibberish of a dying woman. But for Kang Minyi, the word was a physical blow. It was the term of endearment for mother, the exact inflection his own mother had used as she tucked him into a pile of rags in 1985, telling him to stay quiet until she returned. Minyi's breath stilled. His slick-back hair and polished exterior suddenly felt like a costume he had outgrown. The Ice King didn't just crack, he shattered. He finally closed his eyes, his face becoming heavy with a recognition that outranked 3 decades of denial. He wasn't seeing a witness in a light-colored coat anymore. He was seeing the boy he used to be, hearing the language he had forbidden himself from even thinking. A single tear, hot and unbidden, traced a slow, silver path down his weathered cheek. "What did she say?" Jintik demanded, his voice rising in suspicion. He looked from the sobbing woman to the silent, weeping boss. He sensed a secret connection, a hidden thread of identity that threatened the very foundation of the organization. He tightened his grip on Emily's arm, shaking her. "What language is that? Answer me." Minyi didn't open his eyes. He stayed in that darkness, in that memory of soul, savoring the sound of the word one last time before the violence began. He knew that by letting that tear fall, he had signed his own death warrant. He had shown softness in front of the wolves. He had exposed the Ice King as a fraud, a man who still had a mother, a heritage, and a soul. "Leave her alone," Minyi said. His voice wasn't the clinical hum of the boss anymore. It was low, raw, and carried the unmistakable cadence of a man who had reclaimed his name. Jintik let go of Emily, but he didn't step back. Instead, he turned fully toward Minyi, his hand resting openly on the grip of his weapon. The men in the background, those blurred sentinels of the underworld, shifted their stances. The tension was no longer about a witness, it was about the crown. "You know what she said," Jintik hissed, the realization of the boss's weakness finally dawning on him. "You understand her. All this time, the Ice King was just a refugee playing dress-up." The split composition of the room was now absolute. On one side, Emily Carter, the accidental catalyst, sat gasping for air, her mouth still open from the words she hadn't meant to speak. On the other, the two titans of the organization faced each other across a diagonal divide of loyalty and betrayal. The word that broke the world had been spoken, and as Minyi finally opened his eyes, they were no longer cold. They were focused with a new, lethal purpose. "The word was mother, Jintik," Minyi said, stepping into the light. "And in my world, that word is the only one that matters." The enforcer's eyes narrowed, his pupils large with the thrill of the coming coup. He saw the heavy lines on Minyi's face and the tear on his cheek, and he mistook them for defeat. He didn't realize that a man who has nothing left to hide is the most dangerous man in the room. The psychological tension had reached its breaking point, and as the men in the background waited for the signal, the Ice King finally let the world end so that the man could begin. The word Iyama didn't just hang in the air of the warehouse. It acted as a temporal rift, dragging Kang Minyi out of the cold, steel-and-glass reality of his American empire and back to the suffocating gray of a Seoul winter in 1985. As his eyes remained closed, the single tear on his cheek became a bridge to a past he had spent 30 years trying to burn. In his mind, the roar of the city's industrial fans became the biting whistle of the wind through the alleyways of Garyong. He was 7 years old again, his small fingers numb inside oversized wool mittens that were matted with dirt. He remembered the specific, metallic scent of the charcoal briquettes used for heating, and the way the sky always looked like a bruised plum just before the snow fell. This was the year the Ice King was born, though at the time, he was just Minyi, a boy who believed his mother's voice was the only thing that kept the stars from falling. The trauma of 1985 was rooted in a single afternoon of absolute silence. His mother, her face gaunt but her eyes filled with a desperate, fierce love, had tucked him behind a stack of wooden crates in an alleyway near the international shipping docks. She had knelt before him, her breath a white cloud in the freezing air, and whispered the instructions that would become the blueprint for his survival. "Do not speak. Do not move. Forget your name. If you want to live, you must become someone else." She had called him Yuri Gangaji, my little puppy, and told him she would be back by the time the street lamps flickered to life. But the lamps hummed, and the sun vanished, and the snow began to bury the crates, and she never returned. Minyi had waited until his heartbeat was the only sound left in the world. He realized then that language was a luxury of the protected. To be Korean was to be a victim. To be a nobody was to be a survivor. He had crawled out from behind those crates and effectively murdered the boy he was, trading his native tongue for the cold, adaptive mimicry of the Westerners who patrolled the docks. The ghost of 1985 followed him across the ocean. He rose through the ranks of the underworld not by being the strongest, but by being the most culturally hollow. He learned English with a clinical precision that erased any hint of an accent, adopting the slick-back hair and the dark, monochromatic suits of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Every time a stray thought in Korean entered his mind, he suppressed it with a memory of that cold alley. He told himself that the Ice King didn't have a mother. He was a man who had birthed himself from the shadows of a foreign city. Now standing in the interrogation room with Emily Carter, the ghost had finally caught up. The woman's accidental slip of the tongue, Iyama, Jebel, wasn't just a word. It was the exact frequency of his mother's final whisper. It shattered the 30-year-old seal on his memory. He realized with a terrifying clarity that his ice-vein temperament wasn't strength. It was a state of permanent mourning. He had spent his entire life running away from a 7-year-old boy who was still waiting behind a crate in the snow. The men in the background, led by the increasingly lethal Seo Jin-teek, saw a boss who was lost in thought. They didn't see the alleyway. They didn't see the mittens or the charcoal smoke. They only saw a man who had let a witness's gibberish reach his heart. But as Minyi's eyes finally snapped open, the Ice King was gone. In his place was a man who remembered his name, and more importantly, he remembered why his mother had told him to forget it, to protect the only thing left worth saving. He looked at Emily, her light-colored coat now a symbol of the innocence he had lost in 1985. The blood debt of his survival was finally due, and he realized that the only way to honor the mother who had disappeared was to save the woman who had accidentally called her back. The flashback had ended, but the transformation was permanent. The Ice King had melted, leaving behind a man of fire. The blood debt was a ledger Antonio, now Minyi in the quiet of his own mind, had been balancing for 30 years, and the interest had finally become unbearable. To the outside world, his ascent through the ranks of the city's most ruthless syndicate was a masterclass in assimilation. He was the man who never spoke of home, never sought out the comforts of Koreatown, and never let a single syllable of his past contaminate his professional quiet. He had climbed the hierarchy by becoming a void, a man who was so American that he made the locals look like tourists. He had systematically hunted down every part of himself that felt soft or foreign, believing that to survive the failed system of the streets, he had to become the very machine that ran it. His rise was fueled by a cold, clinical efficiency that left no room for the man. He remembered the first time he had been ordered to take a life. It was a drizzling night in South Boston, and he had looked at the target not as a human being, but as a barrier to the safety his mother had promised. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't prayed. He had simply become the Ice King, a title he wore like a shroud. Every promotion, every territory he seized, and every rival he dismantled was a payment on that original debt of survival. He had convinced himself that the power he amassed was a wall high enough to keep the ghosts out. But the problem with building a wall of blood is that the foundation is always wet. Minyi's office in those peak years was a temple to his self-imposed exile. There were no photos of family, no mementos of a childhood, and certainly no books in Korean. He surrounded himself with the trappings of Western success, Italian leather, aged Scotch, and a vocabulary of corporate speak that masked the violence of his trade. He had suppressed his soul so deeply that he eventually forgot it was there. He lived in a state of permanent performance, a Michael Rodriguez or a Kang Min-yi, who was merely a role played by a boy who was still freezing in a 1985 alleyway. The blood debt wasn't just the people he had killed. It was the man he had murdered within himself to stay alive. Co Jinteek had been the perfect lieutenant for that version of the boss. Jinteek didn't want a mentor with a soul. He wanted a commander who was as cold as the steel in his hand. He had watched Minyi rise with a mixture of envy and awe, never realizing that the boss's ice veins were actually a defense mechanism. Jinteek thrived in the void Minyi created, building his own reputation on the raw violence that the boss merely directed. To Jinteek, the organization was a living thing that demanded total loyalty to the now, and anyone who looked back at the before was a traitor to the strength of the collective. The blood debt reached its tipping point in the moments following Emily's whispered plea. As Minyi stood there, the tear on his cheek was the first leak in a dam that had held for 3 decades. He realized that by suppressing his identity to protect himself, he had actually left himself completely vulnerable. He had no roots to hold him steady when the storm hit. He looked at Jinteek and saw the monster he had helped raise, a man who saw heritage as a weakness and memory as a liability. The debt was finally due, and it wouldn't be paid in cash or territory. It would be paid in the absolute destruction of the Ice King persona. Minyi's hands, which had been steady for 30 years, finally began to tremble. It wasn't fear of Jinteek or the guns in the shadows. It was the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of a ghost coming back to life. He looked at Emily, her presence in the room acting as a mirror that showed him exactly what he had traded away. He had traded his name, his language, and his mother's memory for a dark suit and a throne made of ice. The blood debt was the realization that he had become the very thing his mother had died to help him escape, a man with no home. The chapter of the blood debt was closing, and the chapter of suspicion in the ranks was beginning. Jinteek's eyes were narrow, his focus sharpening on the boss's visible distress. The enforcer could sense that the machine was breaking. He saw the Ice King melting into something unrecognizable, something human. And in the underworld, being human was the only crime that couldn't be forgiven. The debt was being called in, and the price was the crown. The shift in power within the hideout was no longer a theory. It was a physical weight in the air. Co Jinteek stood with his chin slightly raised, his eyes tracking the single, silver path of the tear on Minyi's face with the clinical focus of a vulture watching a wounded lion. In the world they occupied, vulnerability was a contagious disease, and the Ice King had just been identified as patient zero. Jinteek didn't understand the word the woman had spoken, but he understood the result. The man who had ruled through absolute, unblinking detachment had just blinked. Jinteek's suspicion didn't manifest as a loud accusation. He was too smart for that. Instead, it was a subtle withdrawal of deference. He didn't lower his weapon, and he didn't step back into the shadows of the silent threat. He stayed in the light, his presence a direct challenge to the boss's center of gravity. He looked at the men in the background, the soldiers whose loyalty was built on the myth of Minyi's invincibility, and saw them mirroring his own unease. They were muscle, and muscle only follows the strongest nerve. "Boss," Jinteek said, his voice dropping into a register that was far too familiar, "you're not yourself. This woman, she's done something to you, some kind of psychological play." He took a step toward Emily, deliberately ignoring Minyi's earlier command for her to be left alone. "I've seen this before. A witness tries to find a crack, a way to make the executioner feel like a man again. But you're not a man, Minyi. You're the Ice King. And the Ice King doesn't cry over a word he doesn't even know." Minyi felt the suspicion in the ranks like a cold wind through a broken window. He saw the way his men were looking at each other, the subtle nods, the hands resting more firmly on their holsters. The seeds of mutiny, which had been dormant for years, were suddenly blooming in the hothouse of his own emotional release. He knew that Jinteek was testing the perimeter of his authority, looking for the exact moment the fear turned into contempt. "I know the word Jinteek," Minyi said. His voice was steady, but it carried a resonance that hadn't been there before, a depth of soul that was terrifying to those who preferred him hollow. "And I know the woman, not her name, but her nature. She didn't choose to be here. I didn't choose for her to speak, but it happened. And now the rules have changed." Jinteek laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. The rules don't change because of a feeling, boss. The rules are the only thing that keeps us from being the ones in the chair. If you let her go, you're telling the city that the Rizzo organization, that your organization, is run by a man who can be broken by a whisper. That's a death warrant. For all of us. The enforcer turned to the men in the shadows, his voice rising to include them in the challenge. Is that what we are now? A charity? Are we going to let the Ice King melt because he had a bad dream about his childhood? The silent threat behind them shifted. A few of the men took a half-step toward Jinteek, their blurred faces hardening into a collective mask of mutiny. The diagonal divide of the room was no longer between the boss and the witness. It was between the past and the future. Minyi stood on the side of a memory he had finally reclaimed, while Jinteek stood on the side of a violence that had no memory at all. Minyi looked at his hands. They were no longer shaking. The suspicion of his men had given him something the silence never could, a reason to fight for himself rather than for the empire. He saw the Ice King for what it truly was, a cage made of his own denial. If Jinteek wanted to take the crown, let him. But he wouldn't take the woman and he wouldn't take the truth. You think you're ready, Jinteek? Minyi asked, his eyes opening fully, the tear now dry but the path it left still visible. You think you can run this city with nothing but blood and ambition? You'll find out very quickly that the ice wasn't just for show. It was the only thing keeping the world from realizing how much I actually hate what we've become. The suspicion in the ranks had reached its boiling point. Jinteek's hand tightened on his gun, his pupils large with the realization that the coup was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. The boss was compromised, and in the underworld, a compromised leader is a liability that must be liquidated. The stage was set for the secret meeting, where Minyi would have to choose between a final act of mercy or a final act of war. The transition from the interrogation floor to the makeshift holding cell in the bowels of the warehouse was a journey into the darkest part of the Ice King's fortress. After the public confrontation with Jinteek, Minyi had ordered the men back to their posts, his authority still barely holding by a fraying thread of habit. He needed a moment of absolute stillness, not the frozen silence of a boss, but the quiet of a seeker. He moved through the dim corridors alone, the rhythmic click of his shoes on the concrete echoing like the ticking of a heart that had been restarted after 30 years of stasis. He found Emily Carter in a small, windowless room that smelled of dust and damp earth. She was no longer bound, but she was trapped by a fear far more restrictive than zip ties. She was curled on a metal cot, her light-colored coat now a crumpled shield against the darkness. When the heavy iron door groaned open, she didn't scream. She simply looked up, her eyes wide and pupils large, reflecting the cone of light from the hallway. Minyi entered and closed the door, cutting off the watchful eyes of the sentinels outside. This was the secret meeting, the moment where the Mafia boss sought a truth that his empire couldn't provide. For a long time he just stood there, his dark suit blending into the shadows. He looked at her not as a witness but as a miracle. "The word you said," Minyi began, his voice a low, melodic hum that lacked the clinical chill of the interrogation room. "Where did you learn it?" Emily pulled her knees tighter to her chest, her mouth slightly open. I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I grew up in the system, different homes. There was a woman, a foster mother maybe, or a neighbor, who used to say it when I was very small. She was kind. It was the only time I felt safe. I haven't thought of it in years. It just came out. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Minyi interrupted, stepping closer. He sat on the edge of a wooden crate across from her, his weathered face settling into a mask of heavy realization. "That word is mother, but not just any mother. It's a term of endearment. It's a plea." He paused, the emotional weight of his next words making them feel like lead. "It's the last thing I said to my own mother in 1985 before she vanished in the snow." The shock in Emily's eyes shifted from fear to a sudden, piercing empathy. She saw the man facing the truth, the Mafia boss who had reached the end of his denial. She saw the single tear track on his cheek and realized that they were both refugees of the same forgotten world. In this secret meeting, the Ice King was finally melting, revealing the boy who had been told to forget his name. "I need to hear it again," Minyi whispered, his eyes closing. "I need to know if the memory is real or if I've just been haunting myself." Emily hesitated, then looked at the man who held her life in his hands. She saw the heavy lines of loss and the slick-back hair that couldn't hide his exhaustion. She leaned forward and spoke the word, her voice no longer a gasp of terror but a soft, intentional gift. "Iyama." The sound acted as a physical catalyst. Minyi's shoulders slumped, the rigid stance of the boss finally surrendering to the man. He felt the blood debt of 30 years of silence finally being settled. He wasn't the king of the city in this room, he was a son. But as the moment of connection deepened, a sharp, metallic sound from the hallway shattered the peace. It was the sound of a safety being flicked off. Minyi's eyes snapped open, the Ice King's instincts returning with a lethal edge. He knew that sound. He knew that Seo Jinteek was outside, watching, listening, and calculating the exact price of this memory. The secret was out, and the price of a memory was about to be paid in blood. Minyi stood up, his dark shirt a shadow against the wall. He looked at Emily and realized that to save her, he would have to destroy the only world he had left. The price of a memory was a currency Seo Jinteek understood perfectly, but he only valued it as leverage for a slaughter. Standing outside the heavy iron door, his ear pressed to the cold steel, the enforcer felt a surge of predatory triumph. He didn't hear a mafia boss conducting an interrogation. He heard a man surrendering his crown to a ghost. When Emily's voice drifted through the gap in the door, "Iyama." Jinteek didn't feel the weight of the history. He felt the weight of the opportunity. To him, the boss's heart hadn't been found. It had been exposed, and in the underworld an exposed heart is just a target. Jinteek pulled back from the door, his eyes narrow and pupils large with the thrill of the hunt. He looked at the 3 soldiers standing with him in the dim corridor. They were the silent threat, men who had been raised on the myth of Minyi's coldness, and were now watching that myth dissolve into a puddle of sentimental weakness. Jinteek didn't need to give a speech. He simply gestured toward the door, his hand resting on the grip of his suppressed weapon. The message was clear. The Ice King was no longer a leader. He was a liability. The memory of 1985 was a debt Minyi was paying with his life, and the organization was about to collect. Inside the room, the atmosphere shifted from revelation to realization. Minyi heard the soft scuff of leather on concrete, the sound of his own men positioning themselves for a breach. He looked at Emily, her face pale, and for the first time in 30 years, the Ice King felt the heat of true, unadulterated fear. It wasn't fear for his own survival, but for the light he had just found in the darkness. He had brought her here to hear a word, and in doing so, he had painted a bullseye on her forehead. "They're coming," Minyi whispered, his voice returning to the clinical hum of a tactician, but with an underlying current of desperation. "Jinteek knows. He won't let us walk out of this room as a man and a woman. He only lets monsters walk through these halls." The breach happened not with a bang, but with a sudden, violent shove of the iron door. Jinteek stepped into the room, flanked by his blurred sentinels. The price of a memory was etched on his face in a cruel, mocking smile. He didn't look at Emily. He looked at Minyi, nodding the dry path of the tear and the way the boss was standing protectively in front of a mere civilian. It was the final evidence he needed to justify the warehouse coup. "You chose a strange hill to die on, Minyi," Jinteek said, his weapon aimed at the center of the boss's chest. "All that power, all that silence, sacrificed for a woman who speaks a dead language. The organization doesn't have room for ghosts, and it certainly doesn't have room for sons." The men in the background shifted, their weapons tracking Minyi's every move. The diagonal divide of the room was now a line of fire. Minyi realized that the price was total. To save the memory of his mother, he would have to kill the men he had called brothers. He looked at Jinteek, the man who represented the pure violence of the life, and felt a sudden, liberating clarity. He was no longer the Ice King. He was a son with a name, and a name is a powerful thing to carry into a fight. The price of a memory is high, Jin-teek, Minyi said, his hand moving with a speed that defied his age toward the weapon hidden beneath his dark jacket. But it's a price I'm finally willing to pay. You want the crown. You'll have to take it from the man because the boss just left the building. The tension snapped. The warehouse coup was no longer a looming threat. It was a physical eruption. As the first shot rang out, echoing through the hollowed-out shell of the Empire, Minyi realized that he was finally free. The memory was safe, the debt was being paid, and the Ice King was finally closing his eyes to the world he hated so he could see the one he had lost. The warehouse coup didn't begin with a declaration of war. It began with the sound of glass shattering, the fragile glass of a 30-year-old lie. As the first muzzle flash illuminated the damp, gray walls of the holding cell, the industrial shell of the Rizzo organization transformed into a slaughterhouse. Kang Minyi, the man who had spent 3 decades avoiding the heat of conflict by staying frozen in his own detachment, suddenly became a blur of kinetic fury. He pushed Emily behind the heavy metal cot, his body acting as a shield of dark wool and muscle against the lead rain Jin-teek unleashed. The noise was absolute, a cacophony of thunderous reports and the metallic scream of ricochets off the iron doorframe. Minyi fired back, his movements no longer the controlled, clinical gestures of a boss, but the raw, instinctual strikes of a man protecting his last connection to the light. He hit the first soldier in the throat, the man's blurred face disappearing into a spray of crimson before he hit the concrete. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a desperate, one-man purge of the monsters he had helped create. "Move," Minyi roared, the sound of his voice tearing through the gunfire like a siren. He grabbed Emily by the arm, dragging her out of the cell and into the labyrinthine corridors of the warehouse. Behind them, Seo Jin-teek's laughter was a jagged, ugly sound. "You can't hide her, Minyi. You can't hide who you are." Jin-teek's voice echoed through the ventilation shafts, a taunting reminder that the organization was a living organism designed to hunt down any sign of humanity. The coup spread like a virus through the levels of the facility. Sentinels who had stood rigid for years suddenly broke rank, their loyalty pivoting toward the man who promised them a future without the Ice King's riddles. Minyi moved through the shadows he knew so well, using the diagonal composition of the architecture to trap his former soldiers in crossfires of their own making. He was the architect of this tomb, and he knew every weak point in the foundation. But for every man he neutralized, 2 more seemed to emerge from the darkness, their dark suits a uniform of betrayal. Emily stumbled beside him, her light-colored coat now stained with oil and soot, her eyes wide with a shock that had transitioned into a hollow, survivalist trance. She was the catalyst, the trigger that had set this world on fire, and as she watched Minyi killed to keep her alive, she realized the true price of a memory. The man she had thought was a monster was tearing his own empire apart to save the one word she had spoken by mistake. They reached the main floor, the vast, echoing space where the wrong witness had first been interrogated. Jin-teek was waiting there, standing in the center of the cone of light, surrounded by the remaining silent threat. The split composition of the room was now a theater of war. Minyi stood at the edge of the darkness, his weapon empty, his dark shirt soaked with sweat and the blood of men he had once commanded. "It's over, Minyi," Jin-teek said, his face calm but heavy with the weight of the crown he was about to steal. "You killed the boss, but you forgot that the boss was the only thing keeping the men from killing you." He raised his gun, his pupils large with finality. Minyi looked at Emily, then back at the enforcer. He felt the single tear track on his cheek, now cold and dry. He realized that the warehouse coup wasn't a failure of his power. It was the ultimate success of his mother's wish. He had forgotten his name to survive, but today he was reclaiming it to live. The atmosphere was somber and cinematic, a redemptive narrative reaching its peak as Minyi prepared for the last command. The moment he would trade his throne for a chance to finally go home. The warehouse had become a hollowed-out ribcage, and the last command was the final breath of a dying beast. Kang Min-yi stood at the edge of the light, his dark suit torn and his slick-back hair falling over his eyes. A mask of perfection finally surrendered to the reality of war. Beside him, Emily Carter was a ghost in a light-colored coat, her presence the only thing keeping the Ice King from turning into a statue of cold regret. Across the vast floor, Seo Jin-teek and his remaining soldiers formed a wall of dark suits and unblinking barrels, the silent threat, now a screaming reality. "This is the end of the line, Min-yi," Jin-teek said, his voice echoing through the rafters. "You've spent 30 years building this. Now you're going to die for a woman who doesn't even know your name." Min-yi didn't look at his weapon, he looked at Emily. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted keycard, the bypass for the heavy reinforced gates at the rear of the docks. He pressed it into her hand, his fingers lingering on hers for a split second. "When I move, you run," he whispered. "Don't look back at the fire. Don't look back at the man, just remember the word." Emily's mouth opened, a silent plea for him to follow, but she saw the finality in his eyes. The Ice King had finally reached the end of his denial. He wasn't staying to protect a territory. He was staying to bury the boss so the sun could be free. He stood up, stepping fully into the cone of light, his posture a masterpiece of authoritative defiance. "Jin-teek," Min-yi's voice boomed, a command that carried the weight of every life he had ever claimed. "You wanted to know what she said. She told me that the Ice King was a lie. She told me that I've been dead for 30 years, and today I'm finally waking up." As he spoke the last command, Min-yi didn't reach for his gun, he reached for the industrial control panel on the central pillar. With a single, brutal strike, he smashed the glass and pulled the lever for the emergency purge. Instantly, the warehouse was plunged into a strobe-like chaos of red emergency flares and hissing steam vents. "Run!" he screamed. The world exploded into a kinetic nightmare. Min-yi charged forward, a dark shadow against the red mist, moving with a speed that bypassed logic. He wasn't shooting to win, he was shooting to distract. He tackled Jin-teek. The two men crashing through a stack of wooden crates, the same kind of crates Min-yi had hidden behind in 1985. The irony was a physical weight as they grappled in the dirt and the dark. Min-yi felt the enforcer's knife bite into his shoulder, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the rhythm of Emily's footsteps fading toward the exit. Jin-teek pinned him down, the younger man's face a mask of predatory triumph. "You're dying for a memory, you old fool." Min-yi smiled, a single tear mixing with the blood on his cheek. He looked up at the man who thought he had won and spoke one last time, not in English, but in the language of the boy from the alley. "KQTIA, it is over." He detonated the secondary charges he had set in the foundation of the vault. The warehouse didn't just burn, it collapsed inward, a symphony of twisted steel and stone that buried the Ice King's empire in a final, thunderous embrace. Through the smoke and the fire, the last thing Min-yi saw was the flash of a light-colored coat disappearing through the gate and into the rain. The command was fulfilled. The witness was gone. And the man who had forgotten his name finally found his peace in the silence of the snow. 6 months had passed since the night the warehouse at the pier became a funeral pyre for the Rizzo organization. In the city, the Ice King was a ghost story, a name used by the police to explain a sudden, violent vacancy in the underworld, and by the street soldiers to warn of the dangers of a boss who finds his soul. The empire had been dismantled from the inside out, and the power struggle that followed had been swift and bloody, leaving nothing behind but the legend of the man who burned his crown for a word he couldn't forget. In the quiet, fog-drenched mountains of Gangwon Province, far from the neon screams of the Western world, a man sat on a wooden porch overlooking a valley of terraced tea fields. He wore no suit, no polished shoes, and his hair was no longer slicked back with the precision of a predator. He was thinner, his face etched with deeper lines of age and a quiet, somber peace. This was no longer Kang Min-yi, the Mafia boss. He was simply Min-yi, a man who had returned to a home he barely remembered to honor a mother he could never replace. He spent his days in the rhythm of the land, a far cry from the blood debt he had paid in the city. The silence here was different. It wasn't the heavy, pressurized silence of the quiet, but the breathing silence of a world that didn't demand he be anyone else. He had used the last of his hidden resources to ensure Emily Carter was settled in a new life under a different name, a world away from the shadows of the hideout. He never contacted her. To her, he was the monster who had saved her. To him, she was the accidental angel who had spoken him back into existence. On the anniversary of the night he was left in the alley in 1985, Minyi walked up a steep, winding path to a small, unmarked grave on the hillside. He carried a single, light-colored cloth, similar in shade to the coat Emily had worn. He knelt in the damp earth, the cold air a familiar friend against his skin. He didn't offer a prayer in English, and he didn't count his losses. Instead, he placed the cloth on the stone and spoke aloud for the first time in months. Iyama, I'm home. Across the ocean, in a bright, bustling library in a city that had forgotten the name Rizzo, a woman paused as she shelved a book on Korean history. She touched a small scar on her arm, a relic of a night of smoke and red flares. She didn't know where the man was, or if he had even survived the fire, but every time she heard the wind whistle through the stacks, she thought of a pair of closed eyes and a single, silver tear. She smiled, a soft, secret thing, and whispered a word of thanks to the ghost who had given her back her life. The quiet return was complete. The Ice King had melted, the sun had returned, and the memory that had once been a cage was now a bridge. As the sun set over the mountains of Gangwon, the man who had forgotten his name finally closed his eyes, not in recognition of death, but in the peaceful acceptance of the truth. The underworld was a lifetime away, and for the first time in 40 years it was finally truly quiet.